February 1971. The jungles along the Laotian border were about to witness one of the most ambitious and disastrous operations of the entire Vietnam War. For years, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been the lifeline of the North Vietnamese war effort, a sprawling network of hidden jungle routes stretching through Laos and Cambodia, funneling weapons, troops, and supplies into South Vietnam. No matter how many bombs the Americans dropped, no matter how many raids were launched, the trail endured. And by 1971, the United States was running out of time. President Richard Nixon had promised the American people that U.S. combat troops would be coming home. His strategy, known as Vietnamization, meant South Vietnam's army, the ARVN, would take over the fighting. To prove they were ready, South Vietnam would have to strike deep into enemy territory without American ground troops beside them. The target, Laos. The mission, to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail once and for all. It was called Operation Lam Son 719. On paper, it looked like the perfect test of Vietnamization. 20,000 ARVN troops, backed by hundreds of U.S. helicopters, artillery, and B-52 bombers, would drive across the border, smash through enemy positions, and destroy the supply network that had kept the war alive. Success would prove that South Vietnam could stand on its own. Failure was unthinkable. But what began as a bold offensive quickly spiraled into chaos. ARVN units bogged down. North Vietnamese forces struck back with overwhelming ferocity. Helicopter after helicopter fell from the sky in flames. And what was meant to showcase South Vietnam's strength ended as a brutal demonstration of its weakness. This is the story of Operation Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos that Nixon hoped would save his strategy and instead exposed its fatal flaws. By early 1971, the Vietnam War had dragged on for more than a decade, and the United States was desperate to find a way out. American casualties were mounting, anti-war protests were growing louder back home, and the political cost of continuing the fight was becoming unbearable. President Richard Nixon needed a plan that would reduce American involvement without simply handing victory to North Vietnam. The answer was Vietnamization. Announced in 1969, the strategy promised that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, would gradually take over combat responsibilities while U.S. troops withdrew. In theory, South Vietnam would be trained, equipped, and motivated enough to defend itself, while America's role shifted to air support, supplies, and advisors. But there was one problem: the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This sprawling network of jungle roads, paths, tunnels, and hidden supply lines stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, feeding men and weapons directly into South Vietnam. It was the enemy's lifeline, and despite years of bombing, it was still fully operational. As long as the trail flowed, North Vietnam could continue the war indefinitely. For Nixon, this was more than a military issue, it was political. He needed proof that Vietnamization was working, proof that South Vietnam's army could carry the fight on its own. For President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon, the stakes were equally high. His regime had to show the South Vietnamese people and the world that ARVN was no longer dependent on American ground troops. The plan was bold and risky. South Vietnamese forces would cross into Laos, a country officially neutral but heavily infiltrated by the North Vietnamese army. The mission: cut the trail, destroy PIABAN supply bases, and cripple enemy logistics. There was one catch. By U.S. law, American ground troops could not cross into Laos. That meant the entire ground offensive would rest on ARVN's shoulders. The United States could provide helicopters, artillery, airstrikes, and logistics, but no combat boots on Laotian soil. This was the gamble of Operation Lam Son 719. To test Vietnamization, not in a controlled environment, but in one of the most hostile and unforgiving battlefields of the entire war. If ARVN succeeded, it would prove that Nixon's strategy was viable, and South Vietnam could defend itself. If it failed, the entire foundation of Vietnamization would collapse, right in front of the world. On paper, Operation Lam Son 719 had a clear set of objectives. At its core, it was designed to strike directly at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of North Vietnam's war machine. For years, this hidden highway of men and munitions had frustrated the United States. Despite the most intense bombing campaign in history, the trail continued to function, absorbing punishment, rerouting through new paths, and funneling more fighters into the South. Cutting it was the dream of every American commander. Now that mission fell to South Vietnam. The plan called for 20,000 ARVN troops to cross into southern Laos along Route 9. Their mission? 1. Destroy enemy supply depots and logistics hubs that fed the trail. 2. Seize and hold key sections of the route, severing North Vietnam's ability to reinforce its forces in the south. 3. Prove ARVN's offensive capability, demonstrating that Vietnamization was not just theory, but reality. The U.S. role would be massive but limited. Over 600 helicopters, from slick Hueys to heavy-lift Chinooks and deadly Cobra gunships, would provide air mobility. American artillery batteries near the border would offer constant fire support. B-52 bombers and fighter bombers would saturate the battlefield, but there would be no American infantry on the ground in Laos. By law, this was ARVN's fight alone. For President Thieu, the stakes were personal. A victory in Laos would show his people that South Vietnam's army was no longer dependent on American ground forces. For Nixon, the stakes were global. A successful Lam Son 719 would prove to the American public and to the world that Vietnamization was working, and U.S. withdrawal could continue without fear of collapse. But these objectives came with dangerous assumptions. The planners believed ARVN could move quickly, strike hard, and withdraw before North Vietnamese forces could react in strength. They assumed the PAVN would not commit major forces deep in Laos, and they trusted that air power could compensate for ARVN's weaknesses. They were wrong. The planners of Operation Lam Son 719 envisioned a swift, aggressive strike, but the forces assembled on both sides reveal why the operation was destined for bloodshed. Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The ground assault into Laos would be carried out entirely by ARVN. Roughly 20,000 soldiers were assigned to the mission, drawn from some of South Vietnam's best formations. The 1st Infantry Division, seasoned from battles in northern provinces. The Airborne Division, elite paratroopers known for discipline and mobility. The Marine Division, among the toughest units ARVN possessed. The 1st Armored Brigade, with American-supplied M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. Several ranger groups, light infantry specialists in counterinsurgency. On paper, this was South Vietnam's finest, but beneath the surface, problems lurked. ARVN's leadership was riddled with political appointments. Many officers lacked combat initiative, and morale was shaky, especially when facing an enemy on foreign soil. United States support. While no American ground troops could cross into Laos, U.S. support was immense. Over 600 helicopters from the 101st Airborne and other aviation units would lift, supply, and cover ARVN troops. Gunships like the AH-1 Cobra prowled the skies, while Hueys ferried soldiers into landing zones under fire. Artillery batteries along the border pounded suspected enemy positions. Above it all, the thunder of B-52 bombers delivered carpet strikes, while F-4 Phantoms and A-1 Sky Raiders swooped low to strafe. American logistics kept the offensive alive, and American air crews took staggering risks to sustain it. People's Army of Vietnam facing ARVN were 40,000 to 60,000 North Vietnamese troops, many already dug in across southern Laos. These were no guerrillas, they were regular soldiers, hardened by years of fighting. The PAVN deployed entire divisions. The 304th and 308th Divisions, veterans of major battles. The 320th Division, tasked with blocking Route 9. The 2nd Division, positioned deeper along the trail. They were backed by Soviet-supplied tanks, T-54s, PT-76, long-range artillery, and, most dangerously, dense anti-aircraft networks of 23mm and 37mm guns, surface-to-air missiles. For U.S. pilots, Laos became a killing ground. Clashing strategies. ARVN's plan: drive quickly along Route 9, set up fire bases, destroy supply caches, and withdraw before the PAVN could organize. PAVN's counter plan: lure ARVN deeper into Laos, stretch their supply lines, then unleash overwhelming counterattacks with artillery, armor, and ambushes. It was a contest between mobility and firepower versus discipline and preparation. The South Vietnamese hoped to demonstrate independence. The North Vietnamese sought to prove the opposite. The battlefield was set, and what unfolded would test not only the strength of armies, but the very idea of Vietnamization itself. Phase 1. Crossing into Laos. At dawn on February 8th, the operation began. ARVN armored columns rolled west along Route 9, the only real highway slicing toward Laos. Behind them, waves of American helicopters lifted airborne troops toward hastily prepared landing zones. The plan was ambitious: establish fire bases inside Laos, secure Route 9, and drive deeper to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go smoothly. Fire bases were established along the border, supply lines extended, and ARVN commanders reported early successes. But the deeper ARVN moved, the more resistance stiffened. Phase 2. The PAVN countermoves. Artillery guns fired preset coordinates, pounding the jungle with explosions. Machine guns swept the wire, and flares lit up the darkness again. The North Vietnamese soldiers tried to get close, but the Americans were ready. The defenders knew every approach route now. Every gun position was locked in, every field of fire mapped out. The attack lasted only minutes before it was crushed under heavy fire. After that night, Firebase Crook went quiet again. No more movement showed on the sensors. The jungle fell silent, not the uneasy silence from before, but the kind that follows total defeat. For the men inside the base, the relief was overwhelming. They were exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, but alive. In 3 nights of fighting, they had faced some of the toughest enemy units in the entire war and sent them back into the jungle broken. The siege was over. Firebase Crook had survived. When the sun rose over Firebase Crook on June 8th, the battlefield was silent. Smoke drifted across the scorched grass. The air smelled of metal, mud, and gunpowder. The defenders finally had time to take in what they had been through. The base was damaged, the bunkers scarred, and the ground outside was littered with weapons, helmets, and craters. But the line had held. Intelligence teams soon confirmed what the soldiers already suspected. The North Vietnamese had thrown everything they had at Crook. Over 400 enemy soldiers were lost in the assaults. In comparison, the Americans had only a few men wounded. Not a single one had fallen. Captured documents revealed the goal of the attack: to wipe out Firebase Crook and open a new path across the Cambodian border. The plan had failed completely. The defense of Crook became one of the most one-sided victories of the war. Commanders later called it a textbook example of how a fire support base could survive a full-scale attack through planning, teamwork, and the coordination of air and artillery support. Every weapon, from the smallest rifle to the largest gunship, had played a role. But for the soldiers who fought there, it wasn't about tactics or numbers. It was about survival. They had lived through 3 nights of chaos, surrounded by explosions and darkness, not knowing if they would see the morning. When the fighting ended, many of them didn't cheer or celebrate. They were simply quiet, too tired to feel proud, too shocked to feel fear anymore. For them, Firebase Crook was no longer just a position on a map. It was a memory that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Firebase Crook continued to operate for several more months. Patrols moved in and out, and the guns kept firing in support of nearby units. But the enemy never returned in force. The lesson had been learned. In the chaos of the Vietnam War, many battles were forgotten. Crook was one of them. But for the men who stood their ground there, it was proof that courage, discipline, and trust in each other could turn the tide, even against impossible odds. Today, nothing remains of Firebase Crook. The bunkers are gone, the trenches filled in, and the jungle has taken everything back. The land is now quiet farmland near the Cambodian border. Villagers walk where artillery once thundered, unaware of what happened there more than 50 years ago. There are no monuments or memorials at the site, no signs marking the place where hundreds of soldiers fought through 3 nights of chaos. To most people, Firebase Crook never existed. But to the men who were there, the memory never fades. They remember the noise, the mortars, the gunships, the screams and explosions that filled the night. They remember the fear, the exhaustion, and the disbelief when they realized they had survived something that should have killed them all. Firebase Crook became a symbol of what the Vietnam War often was. Small groups of men fighting in places nobody had ever heard of, far from home, surrounded by jungle and uncertainty. It showed how preparation, teamwork, and air support could turn a tiny outpost into an unbreakable fortress. Even though it never gained the fame of Khe Sanh, Ripcord, or Marianne, Crook's story is just as powerful. It's the kind of battle that deserves to be remembered, not for the numbers, but for the spirit of the soldiers who refused to give up. They didn't fight for medals or headlines, they fought for each other, and in that they won. In June 1969, on a lonely patch of red dirt near the Cambodian border, a few hundred American soldiers stood their ground against an entire enemy regiment. For 3 nights, the jungle burned around them, and when it was over, Firebase Crook was still standing. It wasn't the biggest battle of the Vietnam War. It wasn't the most famous, but for the men who fought there, it was everything. They proved that courage, discipline, and trust could turn a small firebase into a wall that even the North Vietnamese army couldn't break. The story of Hill 488 is not just about a battle. It's about the unbreakable spirit of a small group of men who refused to give in, no matter the cost. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition, they stood their ground against overwhelming odds and held that barren hill. Their courage wasn't driven by orders or medals. It came from something deeper: loyalty to one another, trust in their training, and the unshakable belief that no man would be left behind. In the face of near certain death, they chose to fight together until the very end. Today, Hill 488 remains a powerful reminder of what courage truly means. It shows us that bravery isn't about the size of your force. It's about the strength of your will. 18 Marines walked up that hill. 6 made the ultimate sacrifice, but because they refused to surrender, every one of them became part of a story that will never be forgotten. A story of brotherhood, resilience, and the will to stand firm when everything is against you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what do you think of the courage shown by these Marines?